Long before modern superpowers debated control of the Arctic, Greenland stood silent beneath shifting ice sheets, vast fjords, and endless polar skies. To outsiders, it appeared empty and lifeless. But for centuries, Greenland was a land of survival, trade, ambition, and quiet geopolitical importance. Long before the United States ever expressed interest in acquiring it, another nation believed Greenland could, and should, belong to them. That nation was Norway. Greenland's strategic value was not immediately obvious. Its climate was harsh, its coastline treacherous, and its interior nearly impassable. Yet its position between Europe and North America made it a natural crossroads of the North Atlantic world. Long before maps were accurate and borders formalized, Greenland existed in a gray zone, geographically distant, politically unclear, and vulnerable to competing claims. To understand Norway's attempt to take Greenland, we must first return to the Viking Age, when Norse sailors crossed stormy seas guided only by stars, experience, and courage. Around the year 985, a Norse explorer named Eric the Red led settlers from Iceland to Greenland's southwestern coast. These settlers established farming communities, churches, and trade routes, linking Greenland culturally and economically to the Scandinavian world. For centuries, Greenland functioned as a Norse outpost, remote, but connected. When Norway and Denmark became united under a single crown in the late Middle Ages, Greenland's political identity became blurred. Over time, Norway's influence waned, and administrative control shifted toward Denmark, especially after the Kalmar Union and later the dissolution of Scandinavian unions. As centuries passed, Norway lost formal sovereignty, but not memory. Greenland faded from everyday politics, yet remained alive in historical claims, legal traditions, and national identity. By the 19th century, Denmark exercised effective control over Greenland, while Norway existed in political union with Sweden. But history was about to reopen old questions. In 1905, Norway regained full independence. A young nation once again stood on its own, eager to reassert itself on the world stage. Norway was deeply connected to the sea, through fishing, shipping, and Arctic exploration. Its people had centuries of experience navigating polar waters. As global interest in the Arctic increased, Norwegian explorers, whalers, and trappers returned north in growing numbers. Greenland once again drew attention. At the time, much of eastern Greenland was largely uninhabited by permanent settlements. Danish presence there was minimal, limited mostly to occasional expeditions and symbolic claims. Norwegian hunters and trappers began overwintering along the eastern coast, building cabins and establishing seasonal stations. To them, the land appeared unused, unmanaged, and open. In Norway, a belief slowly took shape. Denmark's claim to all of Greenland might not be legally sound. This belief was fueled by emerging international law, which emphasized effective occupation, the idea that a nation must actively administer and inhabit a territory to claim sovereignty. Norway argued that Denmark's control over eastern Greenland existed mostly on paper, not in practice. Meanwhile, Norwegians were physically present, working the land, surviving the winters, and maintaining year-round activity. By the early 20th century, Greenland had become more than ice and rock. It was a test of sovereignty, law, and national pride. The situation escalated during the interwar period, when global borders were being questioned and redrawn. Norway saw an opportunity. In 1931, a group of Norwegian trappers, backed by political support at home, raised the Norwegian flag on a stretch of eastern Greenland. They named the territory Eirik Raud's Land, honoring Eric the Red. Norway formally announced its claim. The decision was bold and controversial. Denmark immediately protested, asserting its long-standing sovereignty over all of Greenland. What followed was not a war of weapons, but a war of arguments, treaties, and international law. The dispute was taken to the Permanent Court of International Justice, the predecessor of today's International Court of Justice. For Norway, this moment carried enormous symbolic weight. It was not simply about land. It was about restoring historical rights, asserting independence, and claiming a role in Arctic affairs. For Denmark, Greenland was central to national identity and colonial administration. Losing any part of it would weaken Denmark's position in the North Atlantic. As legal teams prepared their cases, the frozen land itself remained unchanged, silent witness to a struggle unfolding thousands of kilometers away. The outcome would redefine Greenland's future, Norway's ambitions, and the legal principles governing the Arctic. The stage was set for a landmark ruling, one that would decide whether historical presence or modern administration mattered more in the eyes of international law, and Norway was about to discover that history alone was not enough. When Norway raised its flag over eastern Greenland in 1931, the act echoed far beyond the frozen coastlines of the Arctic. What might have appeared as a symbolic gesture by a small group of trappers quickly escalated into one of the most important territorial disputes of the interwar period. The question was no longer who lived on Greenland, but who legally owned it. And the answer would be decided not by explorers or soldiers, but by judges. At the heart of the dispute stood the Permanent Court of International Justice, based in The Hague. This court, created after World War I, was designed to resolve international conflicts through law rather than war. For Norway and Denmark, it became the battlefield on which Greenland's fate would be determined. Norway's legal argument rested on a deceptively simple idea: Denmark had never exercised effective control over all of Greenland. While Danish authority was well established on the western coast, where Inuit communities and colonial administration existed, eastern Greenland remained largely ungoverned. Norway argued that sovereignty could not exist in name alone. According to emerging principles of international law, a claim required active administration, continuous presence, and enforcement. Norwegian lawyers presented evidence of their country's Arctic activities. They documented decades of Norwegian hunting, trapping, mapping, and scientific expeditions along the eastern coast. Cabins had been built. Seasons had been spent overwintering in brutal conditions. From Norway's perspective, this was effective occupation, not conquest, but use and presence. Denmark's response was firm and uncompromising. Danish representatives argued that Greenland had been recognized internationally as a Danish territory for centuries. Treaties, royal decrees, and diplomatic recognition all supported their claim. Denmark emphasized that Greenland was not divided into useful and unused zones. It was a single geographic and political entity. Most importantly, Denmark pointed to a critical diplomatic moment from 1919. At the end of World War I, global borders were being reshaped. During negotiations, Norway had explicitly acknowledged Danish sovereignty over all of Greenland in exchange for support on other territorial matters. To Denmark, this was decisive proof that Norway had already accepted Greenland's status. This single statement would become one of the most damaging elements of Norway's case. As hearings progressed, the court examined historical records stretching back to medieval times. Viking settlements, royal correspondence, colonial trade monopolies, and missionary activity were all scrutinized. The judges were not only deciding a territorial dispute, they were shaping the future interpretation of sovereignty in remote regions. The court also considered Greenland's indigenous population. While eastern Greenland had fewer permanent settlements, Inuit communities had long traveled, hunted, and lived across vast Arctic territories. Denmark argued that its responsibility toward Greenland's indigenous peoples extended across the entire island, regardless of population density. Norway countered that indigenous movement did not equate to modern state administration, a claim that reflected the colonial legal thinking of the era. Outside the courtroom, public opinion in both countries intensified. In Norway, the case was framed as a struggle for national dignity. Many believed Denmark was unfairly clinging to territory it barely governed. In Denmark, the idea of losing any part of Greenland was seen as an unacceptable erosion of sovereignty. The Arctic itself remained distant from these debates. Ice drifted, seasons turned, and the trappers who had sparked the conflict continued their routines, unaware that global legal principles were being shaped around their presence. In 1933, after months of deliberation, the court delivered its verdict. The decision was clear and devastating for Norway. The Permanent Court of International Justice ruled unanimously in favor of Denmark. It declared that Denmark possessed full and exclusive sovereignty over the entirety of Greenland, east and west. Norway's claim was rejected in its entirety. The court's reasoning rested on several pillars. Denmark's long-standing international recognition outweighed Norway's recent presence. Diplomatic acknowledgements mattered more than physical occupation. Most critically, Norway's own prior acceptance of Danish sovereignty undermined its legal position. Norway complied with the ruling. The flag was lowered. The claim of Eirik Raud's land vanished from maps almost as quickly as it had appeared. There was no armed conflict, no rebellion, only a quiet retreat and a lingering sense of national disappointment. For Denmark, the ruling secured Greenland's status for generations to come. For Norway, it was a harsh lesson in international law. History alone could inspire a claim, but recognition and consistency determined its success. Yet the story did not end there. The ruling established precedents that would shape future Arctic disputes. It clarified that symbolic occupation was insufficient without diplomatic legitimacy. It reinforced the idea that remote territories could not be claimed opportunistically. And it quietly elevated Greenland's importance on the global stage. Within a decade, the world would be at war again. And Greenland, once dismissed as a frozen wasteland, would suddenly become one of the most strategically valuable pieces of land on Earth. The court ruling of 1933 appeared to settle Greenland's status once and for all. Denmark held legal sovereignty, Norway withdrew its claim, and the Arctic slipped quietly back into the background of global affairs. But history had other plans. Within a few years, the world descended into chaos, and Greenland, long dismissed as a frozen periphery, suddenly became a strategic centerpiece in a global war. When World War II erupted in 1939, Denmark found itself dangerously exposed. In April 1940, Nazi Germany launched a swift invasion of Denmark. The occupation was rapid and overwhelming. Overnight, Copenhagen fell under German control, and Denmark's government was effectively neutralized. Greenland, thousands of kilometers away, was abruptly cut off from its ruling state. This created a legal and political vacuum unlike anything seen before. Denmark still technically owned Greenland, but it could no longer govern or defend it. Communications were disrupted. Supplies were threatened. And perhaps most importantly, Greenland's strategic position now attracted the attention of powers far beyond Scandinavia. The Arctic was no longer remote. It was vital. Greenland's importance lay in three critical factors: geography, resources, and weather. Positioned between North America and Europe, Greenland sat directly along North Atlantic air and sea routes. Any nation controlling Greenland could monitor or disrupt transatlantic shipping, the lifeline of the Allied war effort. Even more crucial was weather. In modern warfare, weather forecasting could decide battles. Storms, winds, and temperature shifts shaped naval operations and air missions. Because most North Atlantic weather systems originated in the Arctic, Greenland became the key to predicting conditions across Europe. Whoever controlled Greenland's weather stations gained a powerful strategic advantage. Germany understood this well. Throughout the war, German forces attempted to establish secret weather stations along Greenland's remote coastlines. These stations were often manned by small teams dropped into some of the harshest environments on Earth. Many were never resupplied. Some crews were stranded for years, surviving on minimal provisions, isolated in total silence. At the same time, another resource drew urgent attention: cryolite. At the Ivatup mine in southwestern Greenland, vast deposits of cryolite were extracted. Cryolite was essential for aluminum production, a material critical for aircraft manufacturing. Without a steady supply, Allied air power would be severely weakened. Protecting Greenland was no longer optional. Although the United States had not yet entered the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized the danger. If Germany gained a foothold in Greenland, it could threaten North America directly. Yet Greenland was not American territory, and Denmark was under occupation. A solution had to be found. In 1941, the Danish ambassador to the United States, acting independently of the occupied government in Copenhagen, signed an agreement allowing the U.S. to defend Greenland. This decision was extraordinary. It bypassed a sovereign government under duress and placed Greenland's security in American hands. U.S. forces moved in swiftly. American troops constructed airfields, harbors, and weather stations across Greenland. Bases such as Bluie West and Bluie East, coded military installations, appeared seemingly overnight. For the first time, Greenland hosted a large foreign military presence. The Arctic became militarized. Convoys crossed icy waters under constant threat from German submarines. aircraft flew perilous routes through freezing storms. Greenland transformed from an isolated territory into a logistical hub linking North America to Europe. Importantly, this shift occurred without formal annexation. The United States did not claim Greenland. Instead, it exercised de facto control under the justification of defense. But the precedent was clear: Greenland's security was now inseparable from American interests. Meanwhile, Denmark watched helplessly from occupation. Norway, too, was under German control. The country that had once attempted to claim Greenland now shared Denmark's fate, occupied, powerless, and sidelined from Arctic affairs. The 1933 court ruling suddenly seemed less important than the realities of military power. By 1945, the war ended. Germany was defeated. Denmark was liberated, but Greenland did not return to the quiet obscurity of the pre-war era. Something fundamental had changed. The United States remained, American bases were not dismantled. Weather stations continued operations. Strategic planning now viewed Greenland as an essential component of North Atlantic defense. The island's value was no longer theoretical, it had been proven under wartime conditions. Denmark faced a new reality. While sovereignty remained intact, Greenland could no longer be defended or administered without cooperation from powerful allies. The balance of influence had shifted permanently. For Greenland itself, the war marked the beginning of transformation. Infrastructure expanded. Contact with the outside world increased. The island was no longer just a colony, it was a strategic asset, and for the United States, the lesson was unmistakable: Greenland was too important to ignore. In the decades that followed, as the Cold War emerged and superpower rivalry intensified, Greenland would once again become the focus of global attention. This time, not as a forgotten Arctic frontier, but as a cornerstone of modern geopolitics, and soon, the United States would make its boldest move yet. When World War II ended, the fighting stopped, but the tension did not. Almost immediately, a new global struggle emerged, one defined not by open battlefields, but by ideology, influence, and nuclear fear. The Cold War transformed the Arctic from a wartime necessity into a permanent strategic frontier. And at the center of that frozen frontier stood Greenland. The United States had entered Greenland as a wartime protector. But by the late 1940s, it was clear that this presence would not be temporary. As relations between the United States and the Soviet Union deteriorated, military planners began searching for defensive positions that could protect North America from a potential nuclear attack. Geography, once again, dictated strategy. Greenland's location was unavoidable. Any Soviet bomber traveling the shortest route to North America would pass over the Arctic. Greenland sat directly beneath those paths. Control of airspace, early warning systems, and forward bases suddenly mattered more than ever before. The island was no longer just valuable, it was indispensable. Denmark, newly liberated but weakened by occupation, faced a difficult choice. It lacked the resources to defend Greenland alone, yet it was determined to preserve sovereignty. The solution was cooperation. In 1949, Denmark became a founding member of NATO, aligning its security with the Western Bloc and formally tying Greenland's defense to the United States. That same year, the United States quietly made a remarkable proposal. Washington offered to buy Greenland. The offer reportedly amounted to $100 million in gold, a staggering sum at the time. For American officials, the logic was straightforward. Greenland was already being defended by U.S. forces. American infrastructure was expanding. Ownership would simplify command, eliminate diplomatic complications, and permanently secure the Arctic flank. This was not America's first attempt at acquiring Greenland. In fact, similar proposals had been floated as early as the 19th century. But in the tense early years of the Cold War, the offer carried new urgency. Denmark refused. The rejection was polite but firm. Greenland, Danish officials insisted, was not for sale. Accepting the offer would have undermined national sovereignty and set a dangerous precedent. Denmark chose partnership over surrender, allowing the U.S. to expand its military footprint while retaining legal control. Nowhere symbolized this arrangement more clearly than Thule Air Base. Constructed in the early 1950s in northwest Greenland, Thule became one of the most important American military installations on Earth. It housed long-range bombers, radar systems, and later components of missile defense networks. From Thule, the United States could monitor Soviet activity across the Arctic and respond within minutes. The base operated at the edge of human endurance. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Darkness lasted months. Yet thousands of personnel rotated through the base, maintaining constant vigilance in preparation for a war that everyone feared, but hoped would never come. For Greenland's Inuit population, the Cold War brought profound change. Entire communities were relocated to make way for military expansion. Traditional lifestyles were disrupted by modernization, wage labor, and foreign presence. While infrastructure improved, the cost was cultural upheaval. Decisions about Greenland's future were increasingly made far from its shores. Meanwhile, Denmark restructured its relationship with Greenland. In 1953, Greenland's colonial status was formally abolished, and the island became an integral part of the Danish kingdom. This move was intended to modernize governance and assert equality, but it also tightened Denmark's grip at a time when international interest was growing. As the Cold War intensified, Greenland became embedded in a vast network of surveillance and defense. Radar stations formed part of the distant early warning line, scanning the skies for incoming bombers. Submarines prowled beneath Arctic ice. The island stood silently between two nuclear superpowers. Norway, watching from across the Arctic, played a very different role now. Once an aspiring claimant, it had become a NATO ally, hosting its own strategic bases while fully accepting Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland. The ambitions of the 1930s had faded, replaced by alliance politics and collective defense. By the late 20th century, the Cold War began to thaw. The Soviet Union collapsed. Nuclear tensions eased. Some question whether Greenland's strategic importance would fade with them. It did not. New concerns emerged: missile defense, space tracking, and eventually, climate change. Melting ice revealed new shipping routes and untapped resources. Once again, Greenland found itself at the intersection of global ambition, and once again, the United States took notice. In the 21st century, American interest resurfaced in a way that stunned observers. In 2019, President Donald Trump publicly confirmed that the United States had explored the idea of purchasing Greenland, reviving a proposal many believed belonged to history. The reaction was swift and dismissive. Denmark rejected the idea outright. Greenland's own government made its position clear: the island was not property to be traded. The moment passed quickly, but it revealed something enduring. Greenland was still seen as a prize, from Viking settlements to Norwegian claims, from world wars to Cold War standoffs. Greenland's story had followed a consistent pattern. Great powers came and went. Flags were raised and lowered. Courts ruled, armies arrived, and diplomats negotiated, but the ice remained, and beneath it, the quiet truth persisted: Greenland's importance was never about who wanted it most, but about who understood its value in a changing world. Greenland has never truly belonged to a single moment in history. It has existed across eras as a land both remote and central, isolated yet indispensable. As the Cold War receded into memory, some believed Greenland would finally step out of the shadow of global power politics. Instead, the 21st century brought new forces, subtler than armies, but no less transformative. Climate change reshaped the Arctic faster than any treaty or war ever could. Rising temperatures began melting Greenland's ice sheet at an unprecedented rate. Glaciers retreated. Sea ice thinned. What had once been locked beneath centuries of ice slowly emerged: coastlines, minerals, and new maritime pathways. The Arctic Ocean, long considered impassable, began opening during summer months, reshaping global trade calculations. Greenland was no longer frozen in time. The melting ice revealed economic potential that had long been inaccessible. Rare earth elements, uranium, iron ore, and other critical minerals suddenly became viable targets for extraction. These resources were essential for modern technology: smartphones, electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, and military hardware. As global demand surged, Greenland's underground wealth attracted international attention. Among the most interested parties was China. Through investment proposals and infrastructure offers, Chinese companies sought access to Greenland's mineral sector. Though many projects stalled or were cancelled, The interest alone sent ripples through Western capitals. The United States responded with renewed urgency. American officials increased diplomatic engagement, reopened consulates, and expanded economic partnerships. The logic was familiar. Greenland's geography still mattered, but now its resources and political alignment mattered just as much. Competition returned, not in the form of occupation, but influence. For Denmark, the challenge was delicate. Greenland remained part of the Danish realm, but its internal political autonomy had grown significantly. Since the introduction of Home Rule in 1979 and expanded self-government in 2009, Greenland controlled many domestic affairs, including natural resources. Independence was no longer a theoretical concept, it was an active discussion. In Greenland's capital, Nuuk, debates about economic development, environmental protection, and national identity intensified. Many Greenlanders saw resource extraction as a path toward financial independence from Denmark. Others feared environmental damage and cultural erosion. The island stood at a crossroads. Greenland's indigenous Inuit population had lived with the consequences of outside decisions for centuries. From colonial trade monopolies to Cold War base construction, Greenlanders often bore the costs without controlling the outcomes. The modern era offered a chance to redefine that relationship, yet sovereignty in the modern world is complex. Independence would require economic self-sufficiency, political stability, and international partnerships. Greenland's population was small. Infrastructure remained limited. Climate change, while opening opportunities, also threatened traditional hunting practices in coastal communities. Meanwhile, global powers watched closely. The Arctic became a stage for subtle rivalry. Russia expanded its northern military presence. NATO conducted Arctic exercises. New shipping routes promised faster connections between Asia and Europe. Greenland sat quietly at the center of these shifting dynamics, no longer ignored, but carefully observed. The legacy of Norway's failed claim, Denmark's legal victory, and America's military presence all converged in the present moment. Greenland had been claimed, defended, and coveted, but rarely consulted. That, at last, began to change. Greenland's leaders increasingly emphasized that the island was not an object to be purchased or occupied. It was a society, a culture, and a future nation in its own right. When foreign leaders spoke of Greenland as a strategic asset, Greenlanders responded with a simple message: decisions about Greenland belong to Greenland. The world was finally listening. The story that began with Viking settlements and courtroom battles now faced its most important chapter. The question was no longer who could take Greenland, but how Greenland would define itself in a rapidly changing Arctic. History had shown what happened when others decided its fate. The future would test whether Greenland could decide it for itself, and beneath the melting ice, beneath the attention of global powers, the island continued to endure, silent, resilient, and no longer invisible.